Lucille Charlotte Burns was born in Elgin on February 21st, 1905. She lived on the east side of town, and she was a student and graduate of Elgin High School. She later worked at Swan's department store as a salesperson. In 1925, she was invited to participate in what was then called a Pageant of Progress, sponsored by the Elgin Motor Club. The pageant differed in many ways from what we would think of as a Miss America pageant today. There was no talent competition, no question and answer period about what you want to be when you grow up or how you're going to solve world hunger or bring about world peace. This was strictly a beauty contest. But it was part of a larger pageant that had a goal of advertising the city of Elgin and its principal product, the Elgin watch. Other events at the pageant were exhibitions of goods from around various manufacturers in town, a display of the latest automobiles, and a contest for the 100% perfect baby. We all had one of those, right? Participants in the beauty pageant could expect to receive prizes and acclaim. So 36 young women between the ages of 16 and 30 entered the contest. They were all given identical in design swimsuits to wear for the judging. They were two-piece suits with mid-thigh length bottoms and a top and skirt that covered most of the bottom. Preliminary judging eliminated about 1/3 of the young women based on poise, form, and facial beauty. Further judging reduced the number in the contest to just 4 young women. At that point, in order to make a final judgment, the judges had to resort to what they knew best about judging horses. They brought in a dentist and they chose the candidate with the best teeth. Lucille Burns was crowned Miss Elgin 1925 and given a sash, a scepter, and a robe at her coronation ball. The national contest was held in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and the cost of transportation, room, and board was paid for by the contest. Lucille traveled with her mother to Atlantic City. This is important because none of the contestants were allowed to leave the hotel unchaperoned. This was, of course, 1925. She was eliminated in the first round of competition, but she was able to promote the Elgin Watch Company during the various parades that they held during the event. She would point to her Elgin watch as she participated in the parade. And during the gatherings or photo opportunities that were held at the contest, there was often cries from the crowd to tell the correct time, and she would. She would look at her Elgin watch and proclaim the correct time, much to their delight. Lucille Charlotte Burns married Clifford William Krieger on September 6, 1927. Clifford was also born and raised in Elgin. He was a graduate of Elgin High School as well. At the time of their marriage, Clifford worked as a salesman for a biscuit company. But by 1940, he had become state superintendent of the Texaco Oil Company, and they were living in Normal, Illinois. Clifford died in 1980, Lucille in 1992, and they're both buried here in Bluff City Cemetery.
Hi guys. I was born in 1839, so I'm a little older than some of you. That was a joke. My family moved here in 1845, and we settled over on the west side of town. My early schooling was public schools, but I had the distinct honor at the time, I didn't know it, I was one of the first members of the Elgin Academy, and the very first class. And in 1855, my mother passed away. That was very hard for the family because we had 6 brothers and sisters, and my dad took it very hard. Then my father, then I ran across this Elgin militia unit here in town. It was called the Elgin Continentals. They wore 1776 style uniforms, like the Continental Army, the George Washington style. Is anyone familiar with that uniform? The long coat and the tricorn hats. Anyway, I joined up with them and learned quite a bit. I was totally enthused with the uniform and the regulation and the precision of the drill. And we drilled and drilled, and we got very, very good at it. We did performances, hosted competitions, and traveled all over, well, you call it the Midwest now, but back then it was out west. My father was a little upset with that. He thought I was getting too much into the military thing. Anyway, he sent me to Notre Dame College to get away from the Elgin military. Well, that didn't work. As soon as I got there, I joined their military unit. And I quickly became their drill master, and eventually their captain of cadets. Well, my dad got wind of that, and he says, you're coming home. He brought me back home. As soon as I got here, I hooked back up with the Elgin Cadets again. So there was no keeping me down. I ran into a really nice young fellow in the cadets. His name was Elmer E. Ellsworth. Has anyone ever heard that name? Well, Elmer went on to have the misfortune of being the first Union officer killed in the Civil War. And he was also a good friend of Abraham Lincoln. And it was kind of devastating because he was a really nice young man. So my father finally gave up. He said, go back to Notre Dame. Went back to Notre Dame, and again I joined the cadets, and I was immediately reinstated as the captain of cadets. Well, this was 1860, and everybody knew the war was coming. I mean, it was out there on the horizon. You couldn't ignore it any longer. Finally, in April of 1861, the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, and the war began. President Lincoln called for 75,000 troops. Well, I and the cadets, we were ready to go. But the director at the school, the president rather, said he had no authority to let any boy under 21 enlist without permission. Well, I was already over 21, so it was no problem for me, but some of the other boys were heartbroken, and I think they snuck off and joined anyway. A few of the guys and myself, we went into South Bend and enlisted as privates. We were sent to Indianapolis, stayed there for like a month. Then they sent us home because the Indiana quotas were full. So, am I going to get into this war or what? You know, I was really worried I wasn't going to see any action. So I traveled up to Chicago, and I enlisted with the 23rd Volunteer Infantry under Colonel Mulligan. Mulligan's Brigade, they called it, and it was the Irish Brigade. How many have heard of that one? Have you ever heard of the Irish Brigade? Okay. So, because of my past experience with the militia, I was immediately made Sergeant Major, which was kind of neat. I had a whole sleeve full of stripes. And then they wanted me to do recruiting duty to build up the unit. So I was out in the Chicagoland area, and Mulligan's regiment was shipped to Missouri, and they all got captured without me. But I guess that's a good thing. So, but here I am, a sergeant major with no unit. So I went all the way down to Springfield, Illinois, and I talked to Governor Yates. And I said, Governor, I'd like to raise a regiment of my own. Can you handle a regiment? He said, oh, I knew I could do it. I was a little scared, but I knew I could do it. So after getting some letters of referral and recommendations from different prominent people that I have known and knew me, the governor said, go for it, go ahead, go raise your regiment. So I did. So the 58th Illinois Infantry was born. I was now a full colonel, and I had my own guys. I think all of the boys that enlisted from Elgin, I think they were all Irish, every one of them. So we didn't waste any time. Grant launched an offensive down in Tennessee, and we captured Fort Donelson, the first major Union victory of the war. I was very proud of my boys. We did a great job down there. We did lose one man, Bartholomew Kelly, and that was sad because he was an Elgin boy. But we didn't take us long to mourn that because we were on the road again down to Shiloh. How many of you heard of Shiloh? My regiment was in the center of Grant's line. When the day before, we pushed the Confederates back and thought they were retreating. But we were wrong. The reconnaissance was all way off on that one. The next morning, they launched a surprise attack and caught us all off guard. They pushed the Union line back, but we didn't have too far to go because there was a river to our backs. My boys did not give an inch. Our position was holding. But the line kept going back and further on both sides of me. And we were going to soon be cut off and surrounded. I was ready to order a bayonet charge to go through them. And that was the best way to get out of being surrounded. what was left of an Iowa regiment next to me, their officer hung up a white handkerchief on a bayonet to indicate surrender. Oh, I was furious. I ran over there and I ripped it out, that bayonet, and I cursed him. Don't tell the people at St. Mary's. But by that time it was too late. We were surrounded and cut off, and we were all captured. The boys went to different prison camps all through the South. They sent me to Libby prison. But the next day, Grant launched a counterattack and beat the rebels, pushed them back in complete disarray. But I didn't see it. I was on a train to Richmond. And in October of that year, I was extremely lucky. I was exchanged in a prisoner exchange. You know what that is? Okay. So I was able to come home. Oh, by the way, I was wounded at Shiloh. I was hit in the face and in the elbow, and I didn't even know it till the shooting stopped. But by October, I was in pretty good shape, and I came home, and we were greeted in Elgin like heroes. They welcomed us with bands and music, a ball, and wow, like we were heroes. And I said, well, I don't know why. We just did what we're supposed to do in a war, you know. But anyway, after the hoopla died down, after the Elgin thing, I went ahead, after the Elgin, they had me go to Chicago for another celebration. And again, I still don't know why, but I guess they were looking for heroes. And I was happy okay, you know. But it didn't last long. After the hoopla died down, I was ordered to regroup and re-recruit and reorganize my regiment. And back into action we went. This time General Sherman needed us down in Mississippi on a raid on Meridian. And we took part in that. And much to my surprise, he made me acting brigadier general in charge of his 1st Brigade. Whoa! I couldn't find a set of stars fast enough. Well, after that, we went up this campaign called the Red River Campaign. And a lot of people don't know about this one because it's small but a nasty battle. We were on boats and tugs and barges and going up the Red River to try and restore federal authority in Texas. Well, that was a disaster because we didn't have enough support. We didn't have enough supply trains. They couldn't keep up with us. It was just impossible. And we were taking fire from both sides of the river every day. Finally, we had to retreat. And the last battle of that lousy campaign was a place called Yellow Bayou. I was leading a charge against the enemy, and I took a bad hit to the leg. It hurt like heck. And I looked down, there was blood all over me and my horse. My boys dragged me down, took me to the boat for medical care. I've seen what doctors do with leg wounds. And I wasn't going to let that happen to me. No, sir. When they put me in that table, I handed my pistol to my orderly. And I told him, you shoot that son of a bitch if he tries to cut my leg off. You could have heard you could have heard a pin drop in that room. And that doctor's eyes got this big. And he goes, all right, we just wrapped it up, sent me home. Well, that was hard for me because being sent home, crippled per se, and my boys are still out there fighting under another commander now. I was very depressed. I was confined to my house for months. When I was able to move around, they gave me recruiting duty until the end of the war, so I never took to the field again. My career was over. And then to add insult to injury, as soon as the war was over, they demoted me back down to lieutenant colonel. Well, that was lower ranked than I had when I started. So I had a little chat with my friend Ulysses, and somehow mysteriously my rank was just restored. And then after I was retired as a full brigadier general. And in my civilian life, I served in the Elgin City Council. I also served on the Board of Education here in town. I was a devout member of St. Mary's Church. And I also was married to, where is she? Julia Clifford. And we had 6 children. And finally, in 1877, I died. And that's when that leg stopped hurting. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Good morning. I am retired now. My health is not so good. The eyesight is failing. The body, not so good either. But the mind, oh, the mind is still good. I remember everything. Oh, oh. I am Joe. Joseph Pabst. And now they call me Old Joe. When I had my hotel here in Elgin, the Chicago Hotel, they didn't call me Old Joe. I was just Joe. It was the first hotel in Chicago. German beer. The best. When I was a young boy in Germany, I dreamed of coming to America. Oh, America, the land of opportunity. It was not an uncommon dream. Thousands of my countrymen had the same dream, and they did so. There were a couple of reasons why we had the dream. One reason, political. The Prussians were trying to forcibly unify the German independent states and make them one country, oppressing our people. And the second was less political. We had heard from people who came here before us that you could have a better life in America. And so, in 1846, at the age of 16, I came to America too. I came to Chicago. I lived in Chicago for about 9 years. I got married there. But all the time I heard about this place west of Chicago called Elgin. What I heard made me think that I would be more comfortable there than in Chicago. I thought that perhaps it would be more like my home in Bavaria. And so I came here, and I was welcomed by other German immigrants just like myself. They supported me. They helped me get established in my business. There weren't many. It was a small German community, but each year more German immigrants came. One year after another, hundreds more, and hundreds more, and hundreds more. Soon the German farmers outnumbered the American-born, native-born farmers. And so we became known as a predominantly German community. In fact, there were so many of us that there were churches, like my church, St. Joseph's, who was known as a German church. We actually offered our masses in German, and you had the Lutherans who had their services in German. And it was not just the churches, but you might expect the politicians. Oh, the politicians would have speeches in the parks, and you would have one platform over here with the English-speaking politicians. And in the same park, at the same time, you would have a second platform where all of the political speeches were delivered in German. I am proud to say that in 1891, Elgin elected its first German-born American citizen as mayor, Mr. William Grote. I was proud of that moment. My hotel was a very good hotel, and I was very, very determined to make it the kind of place that the typical Elgin business traveler would like to stay. Now, the typical Elgin business traveler were farmers. They came, and you wouldn't expect the farmers to like a fancy, expensive hotel. They preferred the comfortable and decent, clean accommodations that I provided at my hotel. But you see, I knew that I had to do something extra, something special, to make my hotel the place where the farmers would want to stay. So let me read you the advertisement that I placed in the District Democrat on Wednesday, March 30th, 1864. Joseph Pabst, having lately enlarged his hotel, I have to confess to you that ad ran for several years with the same wording, is now prepared to accommodate the public with first-class board and lodgings. He is also prepared to furnish stabling and feed for a large number of horses in well-ventilated stables. Of course, you were a farmer. You're coming to stay at a hotel. You want a place equally comfortable for your horse. My hotel succeeded. But you may be asking, why were farmers, business people, coming to Elgin? What was the reason? Let me explain that. In 1840, when I was still a boy in Germany, most of the farms in Illinois were family farms. People would till the land with wooden plows. They would harvest their crops with hand instruments, scythes. A typical farmer could harvest maybe 3 acres in one day. But between 1840 and 1850, all of that changed. A wonderful revolution occurred on the Western Prairie, as Illinois was called. The first development was that Mr. John Deere, a Vermont blacksmith, came to Illinois and began and invented the iron plow. The second thing was that Mr. Cyrus McCormick transferred his production of his McCormick Reaper from Virginia to Chicago. Those two inventions transformed Illinois agriculture. They transformed the farming life for all the farmers on the Western Prairie. Because now, instead of a farmer producing just enough crops for his family, his productivity increased tenfold. Now he had 90% of his crops available to sell for income. And, of course, Elgin, being the closest place to the Western Prairie where these farmers could come to sell their products, this is where they came. And this is why my hotel was successful. The farmers came to Elgin, and they would then sit down at the table and make contracts with the Elgin Milk Condensing Company to sell their milk. They would then come to the commission merchants, who also advertised here in the newspaper, and they would make agreements to sell their other products, their grain, their butter, and their cheese. And then they would also purchase the things that they needed to work their farms when they went back. So our hotel was a very, very successful enterprise. We did well until 1879. In 1879, a fire destroyed the entire block, my hotel included. I was not affected too much. I had accumulated enough property that I was able to make the decision to retire and not rebuild. And so I did. Oh, the aches and pains of retirement. When I look back on the time that I was here in Elgin, that I conducted my business and my life here, I remember two things that stand out to me more than anything. And one is this: as an immigrant, sometimes looked down upon by the native-born Americans, I had to try harder. But with the support of my fellow Germans and some of the Americans who did, I was able to be successful. And the second thing is the way I conducted my business. I applied a few simple rules. One, work hard. Number two, treat your guests the way you yourself would like to be treated. And number three, most important, live within your means. I am certain that these observations will be excellent rules to follow for those future immigrants who are certain to follow me to America, the land of opportunity. Thank you very much for coming today.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for coming to visit me on this beautiful day. My name is Henry Walter Pixley. I'm usually a very quiet and sedate person, but today I'm going to try to speak more loudly so all of you can hear me. As you visit us here today, you'll look around and see many fine monuments and mausoleums, and meet many people who have been very influential in Elgin's past. You'll recognize names from Elgin's streets, parks, and buildings. You'll hear many names you've heard in your history books or in class. It's important to remember, though, that the history you usually hear covers just a few influential families and individuals. Elgin's history is made up of so much more than that, though. You won't hear my name in class. You won't see my name on fine monuments or hear about me while you wander various places on streets. But if you bought an Elgin pocket watch made between 1880 and 1900, I was most likely involved in making it. I was born in Leon, Michigan in 1848 to parents from New York, and I loved growing up on our rural family farm. I was really able to learn a lot, and I was able to engage in my favorite pastime of hunting when I didn't have chores or education. I went to college in Ypsilanti, Michigan. I started fairly young, and by 1869, I decided to move with my brothers Charles and Ira and my mother Abigail to Mendota, Illinois. In Mendota, my brothers and I learned the fine skill of watchmaking. I guess you can see where some of this is going. Well, it was also while living in Mendota that I met and married my lovely wife, Martha Crawford, whom I call Maddie, in 1872. Still in 1872, after getting married, Maddie and I decided we would move to the city of Elgin. Well, we thought this would be a good move for my career and to start our family. So, accompanied by my mother, who decided to live with us, we moved and settled in Elgin, and I got a job at the Elgin National Watch Company. I worked in one of these many chairs here, constructing and assembling various watches as a jobber. I got to put all the components together, and I was able, with my training as a watchmaker, to be very good about that. But most of us had training as watchmakers at that point. This wasn't a particularly rare skill in a watch factory. In 1873, my first son, Henry Stephen Pixley, was born. I called him Harry, and this made me start thinking about what more I wanted to do. For 2 more years, I kept working in the same job at the watch factory. Not much progressed, and while I was able to know, okay, this went here, there was nothing that was uniquely mine to handle. So in 1875, I decided I was going to make a change. I took my family, my mother was still living with us and she came too, to Amboy, Illinois, where I started to work as a jeweler. Because of my skill as a watchmaker, I very quickly learned the jeweler's trade and was able to put in the finest pieces in the very finest settings. And I found that I was learning a lot. And in 1876, my second child, Fred Raymond Pixley, was born. But in 1879, my mother sadly passed away, just before my daughter, Alice Bell Pixley, was born in 1880. After the passing of my mother, I wanted to be closer to my family again, and my brothers were still in Elgin. And with 2 new mouths to feed, I found that bills were rising. So Having gained many new skills, but being unable to pay my increasing bills, I decided it was time to move back to Elgin. We closed up shop and returned to where we knew we could make a good life for ourselves, and I regained employment at the watch factory. But this time, I was in the jeweling department. And I very quickly became a master jobber in the jeweling department. Now, what this meant was I was responsible for some of the finest, most skillful work we had. I had to place the jewel that was in every watch into the right spot so the shocks could be properly handled and the watch wasn't going too quickly or too slowly. This obviously increased accuracy of our watches. The speed with which myself and other jobbers could do this meant that we could keep selling watches inexpensively. We also did a lot of the settings for the other jewels in there, and before too long I actually became master of the jeweling department, which was a good promotion. There were many such masters throughout the factory, but this was my position and I was doing well. I actually kept working that job for over 20 years. Now, right after our initial return to Elgin, we bought some land at what is now 55 North Liberty Street. And in 1885, once we knew we were going to be staying, we built a beautiful home there. In 1891, not long after my promotion, we could afford to upgrade and expand our home a bit. So we renovated and made the house bigger and added a wonderful tower to it. It's very distinctive. You can still see it today, along with many of the Victorian features that I put in. Now, while living at this house and working at this job, my children, as children tend to, grew up and became their own people. It was a little bit of a surprise. I was fortunate that Harry decided to stay around and he lived close to me. Fred, however, decided to move to Denver, Colorado. He wanted to move off and do his own thing. I didn't get to see him too often, we wrote, but it's a bit of a far distance to travel. Now, Alice actually married a very nice young man from Elgin, a Mr. William Carpenter. He became later quite well known. After working over 20 years in the watch factory for the second time, I decided it was time for me to finally retire. So just after 1900, I settled down into retirement, and don't think this meant that I just sat on the couch and read. I remained very active. You see, I was a member of the International Order of Oddfellows, a very peaceful religion of love, justice, and truth that focuses on community service above all else. As you can see, we were viewed as rather odd at the time for that. I was also a member of the Modern Woodsman and Royal Circle, which was a fraternal benefits organization that, other than providing insurance benefits to its members, again, believed heavily in community service. So for many more years, I remained very active in Elgin, volunteering here and there and participating where I could. After a while, my health started to fade and I found myself starting to drag behind. So I decided it was time to go and visit my son Fred in Denver, Colorado, in the hopes that the crisp mountain air would help me regain my vigor. So, accompanied by Maddie and Harry, we went out to Denver, and after just a short stay of a couple months there, I passed away on September 2nd of 1918. Maddie and Harry brought me back, and I've been here in Elgin ever since. Now, as you can tell, my life wasn't glamorous or well-known. I didn't create Elgin's parks. There's nothing truly magnificent named for me. But like all of my co-workers at the watch factory, and all of the people I came to know in Elgin over the time, each of us in our own small way contributed to making Elgin the amazing city it is today. It's not one person doing something big that makes a city great. It's every person involved. So while all of us made Elgin what you see now, remember it's your job, doing whatever you can to make Elgin great for the future to come. I do thank you for coming to visit me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
It's good to see the members of the press here today. I'd like to begin this news conference, ladies and gentlemen, as time is indeed short. I have received an advance copy of your questions and have prepared answers according to your inquiries. I have chosen to answer your questions in a manner that makes chronological sense to me. So with that in mind, let us begin. The answer to what is the question on most people's minds here today is no. No, to the best of my knowledge, I am not any relation to a gentleman by the name of Rodney.
He must be or must have been a very popular person based on the number of similar questions I reviewed. But in certain circles, I believe that I am just as famous and my name highly recognized and decorated. Bonjour, guten Abend, and bunasiwa. Good afternoon, visitors, and welcome. My name is James Dangerfield, Jr., Elginite, Army Captain, and world traveler. I was born in Elgin in the year of 1875 to parents Anna and James, both well-known and respected citizens of Elgin. My father was a foreman of the machine department at the Elgin National Watch Factory. And like my father before me, I studied the mechanics trade as a youth and worked at the watch factory for a short period of time. Later, I was employed at the Elk Drug Store here in town, yet I believe it was my post-war efforts that made me visible on the world stage as never before envisioned. Somehow these relief efforts brought me to some level of notoriety. In the years prior to the war to end all wars, I became widely known as an industrial engineer. And in that capacity, I joined Herbert Hoover's Commission on Belgian Relief from 1914 to 1917. I spoke both French and German, and a few words here and there of other languages. In 1913, I went to England in the interest of the Single Service Package Corporation, where I remained for nearly 15 months. And while visiting in Belgium, war broke out. So I made my way to Paris and enlisted in the U.S. Army there. During the war, I was assigned to the Ordnance Department, commissioned as a lieutenant, and eventually rose to the level of captain. Toward war's end, I was on the staff of General Pershing, where I remained until mid-April of 1919, when I was discharged. After the Great War, in 1919, I returned to relief work with the American Relief Administration in Romania and with the Near East Relief of Armenia. For these services, I was awarded the French Legion of Honor, as awarded by Marshal Pétain, who at the time was Commander-in-Chief of the French Army, the Belgian Order of the Crown, and the Star of Romania, as awarded by King Albert of Romania. For you see, members of the press, I'm certain I don't have to tell you this, but we Americans were highly revered, highly respected during those crucial years in Europe. And no doubt, when each award was offered and my hand was shook, the hand of Elgin was also shook. Inasmuch as these awards were received in the grateful spirit in which they were offered, I suggest to each and every one of you that the work at hand was reward enough for me. Can you just imagine the feeling of removing some 7,000 plus orphans from war-torn Kars, Turkey, to Alexanderpol, Armenia, thus adding to the 10,000 plus that were already there? A daunting task, as food, clothing, and shelter were precious commodities, and no guarantees were assured once we arrived in Armenia. After my portion of the war relief efforts were completed, I stayed in Europe, living in Lisbon, Portugal, with an occasional visit to my sister in Hartford, Connecticut. I never married, nor had I any children. For several months before my passing, I was suffering from chronic heart ailment and began working my way back to the United States to have that treated. I never made it here alive. I passed away quietly at 8 a.m. in Lisbon San Jose Hospital on the 22nd day of 1941, just a few weeks or a few days shy of my 66th birthday. I was laid here to rest on the 14th of May in what most today would consider to be a highly ornate Portuguese coffin offered to me by the King of Portugal. One which offered a viewing window over my face. As you can see, I lie here with my parents at my side. This concludes today's press conference. I thank you all for your kind and thoughtful attention on this day. And look forward to the thunderous applause that no doubt will follow. But before you leave, I'd like to offer you an up-close and personal view of the very medals that I received. Thank you for your time. God bless you all.
Well, hello everyone, welcome. What a beautiful day today to be out and about, huh? It is a beautiful day to be in the cemetery and to meet so many former Elgin citizens. My name is Emily Lord, not to be confused with the esteemed Mary Lord, who was married to George. The Lord family is a very influential family in Elgin, and unfortunately, although we share the same regal last name, we are not related. I was born in Marlborough, Connecticut on September 29th, 1814. Would you like to sit down, sir? Oh, okay. In 1814. My family, my parents, my siblings, and I arrived in Elgin in 1851, and we are actually considered one of Elgin's early settlers. Now, if I am to be remembered, I suppose it would be for my role as educator. I have always believed strongly in education for all, no doubt due to the influence of my parents, who saw to it that all 5 of their daughters received an education. Now, this was not typical of the day. We attended Ingham University in Leroy, New York. After arriving in Elgin, my sister Ellen and I opened the Elgin Female Seminary. This was in the spring of 1851. Now, as you can guess, it was meant to be a girls' school. However, there were a few young men who chose to attend, and we allowed that. I am not quite sure what their motivation was, but they did attend classes. We first held classes in the basement of the First Congregational Church, which was at that time located on Villa Street near Fulton. We provided boarding for the girls in a house on DuPage Street, not far from the church. By January of 1852, we were able to purchase our own building. We purchased the Elgin House, and we purchased the Elgin House, which was a hotel located on the northeast corner of Chicago and Center Street. Now, it's a nice sized building. We converted the hotel rooms into classes, and we purchased a house directly east of it, again to provide boarding for the girls. My sister Ellen, I, and 10 teachers provided an education for these girls, which included college preparation courses. Unfortunately, we were forced to close the school due to our inability to maintain the school on a profitable basis. We closed in the summer of 1856. Now, as I look back, I believe I understand why that happened. When we were a school, there were only a few small schools in Elgin that were financed by private subscription. They were private schools. However, something changed. In 1851, the state of Illinois passed a statute allowing cities and towns to levy taxes for the purpose of maintaining free public schools. And I'm pleased to note that no one grimaced at the word taxes. I'm glad to see that. Elgin, in fact, was the very first town in the state to avail itself of this statute in 1854. By 1855, the first public school was built. In 1857, the first public high school was dedicated. Education was becoming more and more accessible, which is a good thing. Another event that occurred was in 1856 when the Elgin Academy opened its doors. Now, the Elgin Academy was a private school. However, it offered a coeducational, non-denominational school education for its students. In spite of our short time as being a school, I am very pleased that we are part of the history of Elgin's rich experience in education. I would like to share with you, well, I need to tell you what happened to the building first. After the school closed down, the building was returned to a hotel status until, of all groups, the First Congregational Church purchased this property. The school, the hotel or school, was demolished, and the church constructed a new house of worship. That is the building that stands today on that same location and serves its members today. There is another issue that I would like to speak with you about today before you go, and that is the issue of slavery. I believe strongly against it. There was a growing support in Elgin during my time in town. The abolitionist movement was gaining much support. Baptists and Congregationalists in particular were working hard to repeal those Illinois laws that limited the rights of free Negroes. Now, during this time, there were Negroes in the South that were not yet emancipated. The Union Army called them contraband or captured property, and the Army was not quite sure what to do. Able men were put to work to serve as laborers or cooks or teamsters, but we still had many children and women and unable men left. The Army ordered carloads to be sent north into various cities. 1 to 4 carloads a day arrived in several different cities in the north on the Illinois Union Pacific Railroad. Elgin received 2 carloads, and I refused to call them contraband because they were human beings. They weren't captured property. I wish I could call them families, but you'll know why when I tell you a little more information here. We had 5 men, 28 women, and 77 children arrive on October 15th, 1862. They were in very poor physical health. All of them were malnourished. Many of the children brought diseases with them: diphtheria, smallpox, scarlet fever. At first, they were housed in the basement of Kimball House, and I just wish I could call them families, but you can tell from the numbers that many of these children had no parents with them. They were housed in the basement of the Kimball House, a local hotel, and then the women were distributed to different households, rural and urban households, and were hired as domestics. The children were also distributed depending on who could take the children in and care for them, and they lived also in households, various households. Well, I have to say that the saddest time of the arrival was just a month later, in November that same year, when an epidemic occurred. 16 black children died of smallpox, and nearly 16 white children died of scarlet fever. It was a very sad time. I, as an abolitionist and as a Christian, felt it my duty and my privilege to go into homes and help assist with the Negro children that were ill. Very sad time. I moved to Chicago and eventually died there. I died on April 13th, 1904, after a 1.5 year long illness. Well, you may wonder, why am I here? My body was brought back and arrived at the East Side Depot and was brought to Bluff City Cemetery, where I could be buried next to my family, my parents and some of my siblings. If you turn around, you will see our headstones. Now, Elgin is not my hometown, but I did choose Elgin to be my final resting place because of my strong feelings about the town. I hope you have good connections to your community and that you are... I'm going to stop because I am now beginning to lecture, and I know that that's my teacher voice, and I know that you need to go to other places. So I will stop and thank you for your patience and for your kind attention, and have a good rest of your afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is Christine Irene Oberg, although everyone knew me as Irene. I served as a nurse here at Sherman Hospital in Elgin from 1894 until 1950, and I retired when I was 81 years old. I was the superintendent or head nurse at Sherman Hospital for 23 years. Yes. I was born in Sweden in 1869 to Nels Oberg and Batilda Nelson. When I was just a year old, my family came to the United States and we settled in Crystal Lake. I grew up there, and when I was in my 20s, I attended the Illinois Training School for Nurses in Chicago, and I graduated in 1894 at the age of 25 years old. My very first nursing position after graduation was as a night nurse at Sherman Hospital on Channing Street. I was there for a year until the hospital was moved to Center Street, and this is the new hospital building. And I moved up to the position of Assistant Supervisor of Nurses under the first superintendent, Mary Wheeler. The building was opened in 1895. The title of superintendent was brand new in 1895. And Mary, who had been a nurse like me, was offered this position at $45 a month. Yeah. Sherman started out as a house on Channing Street in 1888, and then in 1895 the new building was built on Center Street. Did you know that during the first 5 years on Channing Street, the hospital cared for 249 patients? But the building couldn't hold more than 7 patients at a time. We needed more space, so we broke ground on the new building at Center Street in 1891 at Stephen Slade's farm, which was land which was purchased by the Women's Club who ran the hospital. When it was completed, the new hospital had 17 patient rooms, 2 operating rooms, sleeping rooms for the nurses, and an apartment for the superintendent. But it was immediately too small. We used Slade's old farmhouse as extra space until an addition could be built on a few years later. When I was at Sherman, Mary Wheeler and I organized the Training School for Nurses, which later became known as the Sherman Hospital of Nursing. The school was started in 1896 and graduated the first class in 1904. The first graduating class totaled 5 nurses. The school was eventually located in Rattan House, which was on the hospital grounds northwest of the original building. I stayed on as assistant supervisor at Sherman for 4 years after that until 1899 when I got a new position at the Swedish Covenant Hospital in Chicago as superintendent. I stayed there for 7 years until 1906. Then I had a brief stint at Chicago Union Hospital before moving back here to Elgin to take on the position of superintendent at Sherman Hospital. I stayed here for 23 years after that, and I finally resigned in 1962 at the age of 59. After that, I continued practicing my profession until 1950. I was 81 years old when I finally retired. When I was 93 years old, I moved from my home on Augusta Street to Restville House after battling a gastric ulcer for 2 months. And then on October 24th, 1962, I died. I lived 6 days after my 93rd birthday. All my life, I served the nursing profession and the doctors of Sherman Hospital. I built my life around the hospital and had many good friends here. When I died, I was buried next to my parents right here in Bluff City Cemetery, survived by my sister Josephine. After my death in 1962, the hospital continued to grow. It went from being a single house on Channing Street to a large complex at Center Street. It went from being able to serve 7 beds to a couple of hundred. If I were alive today, I would probably be sad that the hospital, as I knew it at Center Street, had been torn down. But I would have been amazed at the modern hospital on Randall Road with its new technologies that I never would have dreamed of when I served at the hospital on Center Street. Thank you. You're welcome.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The following is a brief history of Elgin cemeteries. Shortly after Elgin was founded, it became necessary to have a cemetery or a burial ground. An area of burl oaks on a hilltop overlooking the settlement was chosen by James Gifford. This was an area about the size of a half city block. By 1843, the burial grounds were becoming full, and once again James Gifford donated a parcel of land to the city of Elgin for another cemetery. The new cemetery was located in Channing and DuPage Street and had room to expand. Eventually there was room for about 10,000 interments. As the cemetery grew, it became evident that an even bigger cemetery would be needed for the city of Elgin. A search was undertaken, and eventually a horse farm outside of town in Cook County was chosen. The first sexton or superintendent was plotted the new cemetery, and people were invited to move their loved ones from the Channing Street Cemetery to the new cemetery. However, more than half the remains were left at Channing Street due to either no survivors or the survivors were too poor to move their loved ones. There were over 7,200 graves in the old cemetery, but only about 3,500 were moved. When Channing School was first built, the construction crews encountered many sets of remains. These were ultimately brought to Bluff City and buried in a common grave near the fen. Bluff City Cemetery occupies about 108 acres, and about 70,000 people are buried here. Bluff City Cemetery was fashioned after a cemetery in Paris, France, called the Père Lachaise Cemetery. There, the streets were named after Paris streets. Bluff City is like that cemetery in many ways, including the beautiful rolling hills, the stately old trees, and the monumental grave markers. There are 2 major sections of Bluff City that are somewhat restrictive. Those locations are for both the Muslim and the Jewish faiths. Other than those 2 areas, there are no restrictions on who is buried here. All are accepted without question. There is another cemetery here called the Mount Hope Cemetery. Mount Hope is dedicated to those of the Catholic faith. For more information on Bluff City Cemetery and its true preceding cemeteries, check out the book Silent City at the library or purchase a copy at the Elgin History Museum. Thank you all for your attention, and this concludes our presentation for today. I sincerely hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
As we walk through a cemetery, we often see epitaphs on many of the tombstones. What is an epitaph? The word's origin is in the Greek word epitaphios, which means a funeral oration over a tomb. An epitaph is a short text etched on a plaque or gravestone of a loved one to serve as a memorial to him or her. It can be simply the initials of the person, the title of the person, the name, date of birth and death, and may even include a short statement or poem that reflects the loved one's personality. In some cases, the epitaph is provided by the loved one, and in others, it is provided by those left behind. There are epitaphs chosen to give a brief obituary of the loved one, such as, "He paid his bills." Other epitaphs can be a short phrase the loved ones used with each other, such as, "Meet me down yonder in the pawpaw patch." An epitaph may also appear in a monumental or pictorial form, such as the headstones with an oversized golf ball on one side and an oversized bowling ball on the other, or a favorite pet or home engraved on the headstone. The epitaph is something meant to give someone walking by a clue to what and who the person was, and to memorialize him or her.
So the word angel comes from a Greek word meaning messenger. In cemeteries, they are a symbol of spirituality, guarding the tomb and acting as a messenger between God and man. Other than tombstones, the image most often associated with cemeteries is angels. Though all have wings, they are tremendously variable in their posture and expression. While some are draped over tombs in grief, others seem ready to take flight with heavenly joy. Tears stream from the eyes of one, while another's face is filled with adoration. Much of the way we perceive the form of angels was developed by artists in the Middle Ages and was refined during the Renaissance. This was when they acquired their wings, halos, white garments, swords, trumpets, and harps. Most angels are of a generic variety, but two specific angels can be often identified by their instruments they carry, Michael by his sword and Gabriel by his trumpet. For those who don't know, Michael was the leader of the angels who remained faithful to God after the great war in heaven. He overcame Satan and cast him from their midst. It was Gabriel whom God sent to announce the birth of Jesus. Gabriel is perhaps the most depicted angel in the cemetery, aside from the generic angels. The angel with a trumpet is a natural device for signaling the departure of a soul from the earth and its arrival in heaven. Cherubs are often depicted on the graves of children and symbolize innocence. As you can see, this angel has a broken wing. These statues are very old and fragile. There are several angel monuments in Bluff City Cemetery, some of which have been damaged over the years. Thank you for your time, and you may proceed with your guide.
Very angelic presentation. Good afternoon. I'm here today to give you a little bit of information about Mary Jane Gifford. Mary Jane Smith Gifford was a new bride marrying Hezekiah Gifford in January of 1834 in New York. Shortly after that, Hezekiah and his brother James came west to stake a claim and name their new settlement Elgin, which, by the way, was James' favorite hymn. By the spring of 1835, Hezekiah had built his cabin and his farm was cultivated and seeded, and the crops were growing. He sent for Mary Jane, who arrived accompanied by another Gifford brother. For 6 weeks, Mary Jane was the first and only white woman to live in Elgin. There were few families that had settled on the outskirts of Elgin. However, the bad roads made it absolutely impossible to visit anybody. Mary Jane felt the need for female companionship and was very uncomfortable about being left alone when all the men in the community were out working in the fields. She did tell a story once of an unwelcome band of Indians who stopped in shortly after she came west. She was alone in the cabin when a group of Indians walked in without saying a word to her, began helping themselves to her flour, which her husband had made a long trip to Chicago to obtain. Frightened, she struck out with her fist one of the braves who was crouching over the flour barrel, knocking him off balance and sending him sprawling across the floor. This created a great deal of amusement for all of the other Indians. To her relief, they left without making any more trouble. But as they were leaving, Hezekiah was returning home and learned from the Indians about what had happened. He invited them back to the cabin and explained to Mary Jane that they were his friends and neighbors. He told her that they were accustomed to receiving flour from them. In exchange, would give Hezekiah freshly caught fish. Mary Jane adjusted and went on to make a life for herself and Hezekiah, having several children. As you can see at the bottom of her headstone, it does read, first white woman in Elgin, but it must have been quite an adjustment for her. I'd like to thank you for your time, and you may proceed on with your guide.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.